everybody, welcome to the Fire It Up with CJ show. Today we're going to be talking about DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. It's a follow-up to Rick Strassman's great book on DMT. So welcome, Rick.
Well, thanks, CJ. Thanks for having me on your show.
So I have a question for those that are not familiar with DMT. Can you tell us and from reading your book, DMT is a naturally occurring substance in our body, but it's something that we can actually get more of by things like ayahuasca, and there's things that are you describe them as exogenous or endogenous, either things that we produce ourselves or that we can get from outside of our system. Can you explain the different ways we get access to DMT and what DMT is?
Sure. Well, DMT stands for dimethyltryptamine. It's a relatively simple compound, not much bigger than blood sugar, glucose, the molecular weight.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a chemical cousin of serotonin and of melatonin. It was first discovered in psychoactive plants from the Amazon in the 40s, then was found to be psychoactive in humans in the 50s, and then maybe 10 years later was discovered to exist in the tissues of mammals. In the beginning, just rodents, and in particular rabbits. But then a few years after that, it was discovered also in human body fluids and human tissues. It also occurs in thousands of plants, most likely, and in every mammal that's been studied to date. When it was first discovered that the human body, that rodents made DMT, it was determined that the lung is the primary organ for DMT synthesis. And since then, it's been, determined that other organs in the body make DMT, including, most likely the pineal gland of mammals. That was reported in 2013 in rodents, and there are some new data coming out in humans that should be published next year that indicate that's also the case for the human pineal gland. Despite the interest in the pineal gland and DMT, even without a pineal gland, people live mostly normal lives. It seems like, so I think probably on a day-to-day basis, the primary source of endogenous DMT is the lungs.
Interesting. So then there's things that we can facilitate having even more production of DMT, right, through meditation. You talk about things in your book, meditation and prayer, and there are a whole bunch of spiritual practices that also create DMT. Is that right? Did I understand that correctly?
Well, that's not established, data yet. The concentrations of DMT in the body are extremely low, in the order of a trillionth of a gram per milliliter. So it's really quite hard, to measure normal, levels of DMT, let alone any increases or any decreases in one's own levels or in human levels. I think what is going to end up being the case is if we're going to be able to establish that DMT, if DMT activity increases in non-drug states, which resemble those states brought on by giving DMT, we're going to be looking at the genetic apparatus, the genetic machinery responsible for DMT synthesis. So even though, there are some striking similarities between specific or particular non-drug states, and the DMT effect. We still don't really know if levels of DMT or the synthesis of DMT increases in those states. It certainly makes sense that to the extent non-drug states resemble DMT states, there must be some common biological things going on.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, how do you measure DMT then to even know? Is it something you did a series of research in 1990 on DMT, and I don't know whether you've done any research on people who are going through the things that you mentioned, spiritual practices, and if there is a way to measure the amount of DMT in the body.
Well, you can if the concentrations are what's called, pharmacological, concentrations, which result from injecting it or smoking it. But concentrations in everyday normal consciousness are still are still too low to measure. There are a couple of research groups which are looking at the genetic mechanisms behind the synthesis of DMT. So I think it won't be too long until we've got some genetic data regarding if specific DMT synthesizing genes are turned on in states of dreams or near death or meditation, those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. So going back to your studies in the 1990s, so you gave, and it was a period of 5 years, as I understand it, that you're doing these assessments and tests and research. I just had a question on the cumulative effect from repeat dosages of DMT. What did you find as a cumulative effect, if any, and have you had follow-up studies with those people that your original subjects?
Yeah, what do you mean cumulative effects?
Is it like with certain drugs, if you keep on taking those drugs over and over again, it makes you more immune to those drugs, or takes more, like for marijuana, they say it takes more for you to actually have the same effect. Did you find any damaging results of those? So there's certain drugs like the ecstasy that literally create holes in your brain. So did you find anything scary or dangerous about DMT?
Yeah. Well, the first, definition of, cumulative effects is what is, what is referred to as tolerance. You give the same amount of, drug and the response is less. You have to give a larger dose of drug to get the same effect as you did the first time you took it. Well, so that turned out not to be the case with DMT as compared to other psychedelics. For example, if you take LSD every day, after maybe maybe 3 to 4 days, you really don't have much of an effect at all. And that's also the case with mescaline and psilocybin. So there were some older studies in both humans and in lower animals, which attempted to develop tolerance to DMT, and they weren't able to. But the response to DMT is extremely short. Maybe about a half hour, 40 minutes or so. One possibility which occurred to us is that perhaps the spacing of giving repeated doses of DMT had to be quite short. So we gave it 4 times in the space of a morning. Once every half hour, 4 times.
Wow.
And there still wasn't any Yeah, yeah, it's a pretty wild study. Um, yeah, I mean, there, wasn't any tolerance, to the psychological effects of, giving it even at, that, small an interval.
Hmm.
And uh, well, that's a interesting aspect uh, with respect to DMT, too, because one of the drawbacks of giving DMT as an injection or by smoking it is it's quite brief, and it's kind of hard to do any work in that space, psychological work, creativity work, spiritual work, um, and the fact that DMT does not invoke tolerance to itself means you can give it as a continuous infusion, long-term infusion over the space of, several hours perhaps.
Mm.
And, colleague of mine in Japan and I, just a few months ago, published a, paper describing a, mathematical model, a, pharmacology model, which people could use if, they wanted to in the research, setting to give a continuous infusion of DMT.
Mm.
Your second question about any long-term side effects, not really. I mean, I screened my volunteers quite carefully, supervised them very carefully. We were available for follow-up. We gave about 400 doses of DMT to to nearly five dozen volunteers over the space of that 5 years. Um, we screened everybody with a small dose of DMT, and if they didn't, like it, or they, it freaked them out, or they said, "I don't want this," they could drop out of the study. Um, a couple of people experienced a lot of anxiety, but that was, temporary. A couple of people developed, some depression, which was kind of a recurrence of their, previous depressions. But we got on, top of that quite, quickly, and they felt better within a, week or two. Either getting, back on their antidepressants or getting back into psychotherapy. But the long term, the more existential, long term, benefits, or um, or detriment, from having participated in the study, um, that was kind of, subtle. And by the time I completed the first, DMT book, The Spirit Molecule, I kind of considered it a wash.
Hmm.
But when we were, filming our interviews for the DMT documentary, maybe 10, 15 years later, I was, more impressed, with the long-term benefit
Hmm.
of, individuals having participated in this study. They were more creative, they were more easygoing, they were more, comfortable with, their own mortality. They were convinced of, the existence of a spiritual world. Some of them, went into different, fields of work, those kinds of things.
Hmm.
Some people were more inspired and branched out into some new creative ventures. Um,
Hmm.
I don't think anybody, was harmed, permanently from the experience. One person, well, that was on our, psilocybin study, but, one person got, kind of, traumatized, by the hallucinations he experienced on DMT. Well, and even then, I think he made the most of it. He stopped doing drugs. He moved to California with his girlfriend. He, got a job. So even in that case, his so-called challenging experience turned out for the best.
They, I've seen, I did some research here in ayahuasca, which is in the Latin America, the way that people ingest DMT and the experiences, as I'm just telling for folks who may not be familiar, last for maybe 3 or 4 hours. And the gentleman who I interviewed said that the experiences that people have with ayahuasca really vary depending on um, their level of consciousness and what kinds of things they brought in to before taking the ayahuasca journey. And so I wonder to what extent the people that were, the people, their consciousness actually affect the experiences that they have, because even though in the movie they're all wonderful experiences, in the book you talk about experiences where people didn't have necessarily positive experiences and felt various emotions and things like that. So what would you say causes such a dramatic difference in people's, I mean, from a scientific standpoint or maybe a consciousness standpoint, do you think that that affects the people's experience with DMT?
Yeah, I think it does. Well, the three elements of any, drug experience are the drug and the set and the setting.
Mm-hmm.
And with respect, to the drug, it's the dose, all things being equal. And, the set is, the condition of the person
Mm.
at the time of, taking the drug. So that could be, the person's mental health, physical health, um, expectations, their intentions, their past experiences. Um,
Mm.
so that would, I guess, constitute what you're referring to as the person's consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
One's consciousness is, part of the individual's, set as they go into the drug effect. The setting is the external environment. The people that you're doing it with. What the model is. Are you planning on, doing it in a, recreational setting or a clinical research, setting? Are you dying of cancer and you're doing it for, psychotherapy or spiritual purposes? Well, the setting also includes, the set of the people in the room or the
Mm.
space with you. If, they're your friends, if those people are your friends and you trust them, that's one thing. If they're strangers, that's, something else. If, they're your enemies, then that's, different too. If, they expect you to have a good time, that's going to influence your experience. If they expect you to have a bad time,
Mm.
then that's going to influence the experience. In our study, we screened all of our volunteers quite carefully, and we only studied experienced psychedelic users, um, and that was because of the whole issue of informed consent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you really can't describe something like the DMT experience to somebody who's completely naive to the psychedelic state. It would be like saying, "Oh, it's like an LSD trip that's packed into 15 minutes," and if you don't know what LSD is like, then that's not going to really help you much. Um, so, uh, well, the volunteers. Were interested in exploring, their consciousness, getting spiritual insights, psychological insights, physical healing, but they also were altruistic. This was the first new study in the
Mm.
U.S. in a generation, and all the volunteers were extremely, keen on, kind of, I guess, offering up, their minds and their bodies for the future of, science and
Mm.
evolution and the human race.
Mm.
So we did it as much as possible to optimize the mental set, what the expectations were on their part and on our part. On the other hand, the setting was kind of grim. It was a research unit in a busy university hospital, and people were hooked up to a couple of different intravenous lines and temperature, probe in their rectum and all kinds of unpleasant,
Oh,
physical intrusions.
oh no.
But, but that, leads me, to, my conclusion, from that work, especially when it comes to DMT, is, that the most important quality one can bring to that state is, is is the ability to let go,
Mm,
to surrender to the effect in a hopeful, optimistic manner,
mm,
and
mm,
them being in a in and them being in an incomprehensibly unpleasant physical environment, in a way contributed to their being able to let go. Well, in some ways they were completely helpless and strapped down in some ways, so they really were developing the attitude of letting go even before the drug effect began.
mm,
And so the people that resisted either the environment, or they resisted the onset of effects as they came on, those were the ones that had the worst time.
mm.
And the ones who were able to let go in an optimistic, hopeful kind of manner, looking up rather than looking down at the state, those were the ones who got the most benefit out of it, or the most out of it.
Mm. So you were saying about a research, and you're looking at, you did all this research and rectal probe, you looked at hormone levels, you looked at heart rate, you did all this analysis while your research subjects were having this experience. And you also mentioned in the book that I don't know what it is. It's like, so what? Like, so what? What are people going to do with all this incredible information that you've collected? What do you think are the medical possibilities with DMT that we have yet to explore?
Um, well, there's a couple. Well, there are a couple of elements to your question. That question that I was posing toward the end of my study. So what? Like, if DMT thrusts you into this alternate level of reality, what's that really good for? Um, Well, I ought to maybe describe, briefly what the DMT experience is like, at least as what my volunteers described to me by receiving it intravenously. Um, it starts quite quickly, within a few heartbeats, and what you notice is your body becoming light and cool, and then you start to feel a extremely rapidly building sense of inner tension and acceleration, and that's what people would call the rush. uh, well, the room visually would start to break up into a pixelated kind of pattern. There would be the overlaying of kaleidoscopic geometric colorful patterns in I'm I'm in I'm in the air of the room and on the walls of the room. Those got kind of uh, well so early on in the study, it became obvious, that if people had their eyes open and those visions were overlaying the room, it was kind of disorienting. So we started putting eye shades on people after the first couple of weeks of the study. So with your eyes closed, well, those patterns build up in their speed and complexity. uh, there's an there's an ever increasing sound, kind of like a high pitched, whining sound. And so that so the rush culminates in what people routinely described as a separation of their minds from their bodies.
Mm,
And when that happened, it was extremely quiet. There was this deep abiding silence. But the most striking elements were visual. Volunteers' consciousness entered into this world of light,
mm,
which was composed of more colorful, deeply saturated colors than they had ever experienced before. And well, that world of light seemed inhabited, or seemed filled with an intelligence, or a power. And sometimes, or oftentimes, more than half the time, volunteers described, seeing these, things, which we ended up calling beings, but you can call them entities or creatures or whatnot. And, they seem to be the repository of that power and that knowledge, information, agendas even. So when people came, back from that state, oh, okay. Yeah, well, so there'd be an exchange. There was a relationship which developed ever so briefly, as it were, between the beings and the volunteers. So there was communication, visual communication, telepathic communication. But it was kind of a struggle for the volunteers and the beings to establish a clear, reliable channel of communication. Either the language was too different, or the anxiety on the volunteers' part was too great, or the experience was too brief. And for that series of reasons, perhaps most of the volunteers only returned with information regarding the existence of that state and the nature of it. They could describe it extremely carefully, extremely accurately, with a huge amount of detail. But what the meaning of that state was, other than that it is ongoing and exists in almost a freestanding type of manner. Most people didn't return with a lot of information about ethical kinds of issues, moral issues, theological issues, spiritual kinds of insights. Mostly if they did come back with anything new, it was mostly psychological. Just understanding themselves better, as opposed to understanding how to relate to each other better, or how to relate to the spiritual world any better. So that lack of information, but plethora of phenomenological descriptions led me to kind of wonder if anything was actually being accomplished by causing people to enter into this state. So that kind of put me back to the drawing board in a lot of ways, and resulted in my book on prophetic states.
So, in your book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, you talk about prophetic states. For people who aren't familiar with what prophecy is, which in fact I always thought of it as being able to see into the future, and you have a different definition of prophecy. Can you share a definition, and also what does it mean to be in a prophetic state?
Well, yeah, let me give you some background about why I got into the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament and the prophetic state, or the experience of prophecy. The spiritual orientation that I brought to my work at the time was based on a couple of decades of practice and study of Zen Buddhism. And the biological approach that I took was psychopharmacology, and the psychological approach that I took was psychoanalytic, kind of a Freudian approach to the mind. And all three of those systems posit the basic unreality of what my DMT volunteers were undergoing. The psychopharmacology model would consider it your brain on drugs, put simplistically anyway. The psychoanalytic model would considered, the visions and the voices to be the, representation of unconscious conflicts or drives. And even the Buddhist, model, well, the Zen model anyway, would look at the visions and the voices as, detritus, that the mind was, shedding on the way towards the ultimate goal of Buddhist enlightenment, which is considered a state of emptiness, where there's no, self, and there's no ideas, no perceptions, those kinds of things. So all three of those, disciplines, would consider the experiences of the volunteers unreal. So I was, carrying, those three models into my work, and they spilled over into my interviewing, people as they came out of the state, and I was trying to glean as much information as I could. But my underlying existential skepticism, or, phenomenological, well, not existential, but like epistemological skepticism, was, kind of getting in the way. People could, could tell that I didn't quite believe what they were saying. And one of the hallmarks of the DMT experience is the feeling of reality. It feels as real as everyday reality, or even more real. So the volunteers began closing down, some anyway, and I felt I wasn't getting all the information I could. So I performed a thought experiment and figured, well, I'll just take their descriptions of an alternate reality at face value, and then later I can come up with a way in which that makes sense. So after also from the spiritual perspective, the Buddhist model of enlightenment as the ultimate goal didn't really pan out either. I was expecting, in a way, the merging with the white light of emptiness as kind of the final outcome of a big dose of DMT. But only one volunteer even had anything close to that, and everybody else experienced this very busy world where they were intact. They could understand what was going on. They were asking questions, getting answers, interacting with these with the state, and with the contents of that state. They were able to remember things. Their sense of self became as well. It was as intact or even stronger than usual. So even the goal, or the ultimate experience, wasn't at all like the Buddhist formless state of enlightenment, Kensho or Satori. So there were those two factors that made things kind of complicated with respect to understanding what was going on. The busyness, the interactive quality, and also the reality, feeling. So I looked into some of the newer models in physics about dark matter, parallel universes, wormholes, strings, those kinds of things. So they were interesting with respect to providing mechanisms of how DMT might possibly be changing the receiving characteristics of the brain mind complex in order to see into these physical levels of reality, which we otherwise are not able to. It would be akin to looking through a microscope or a telescope. But instead of the sense organs being our eyes, is our minds that were being altered in such a way that we could perceive things that we normally can't, which are all which are which are always there, but we just don't notice them, because our, receiving characteristics aren't up, for the challenge. So I began thinking about, DMT, being kind of like a tool, like a technology, which, would be able to allow our minds to, peer behind the veil, as it were. But even with, those, models, they still, really weren't equipped to or weren't interested in asking questions about, why things are configured this way in the first place. Why, do we all have, DMT in our bodies, which, perhaps in my speculation anyway, would allow us to, peer into other, levels, other levels of existence. So then, to kind of, supplement or, complement, the scientific models, I then, thought, well, the religious models out there, the religious, traditions for, millennia or even longer, have been looking at usually, usually invisible states, usually invisible, layers of reality. But at the same time, besides, developing, tools, to enter into altered states of consciousness, they also, developed ethical, systems, built around the information, which, they are able to extract from those states. So I was really struck, by the paucity of information that the DMT, volunteers were returning with. And I thought, maybe it was a, defect in language or, communication somehow. And if we could understand, what is actually, going on there, if we had some, verbal and, cognitive tools that perhaps we'd be able to extract, more, more of a message, from that state. So the Buddhist model, wasn't all that helpful, because of its emphasis on, the empty state of enlightenment. And so I returned, to my own, tradition. I was raised Jewish, born Jewish. And I, began to read the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament. So after a while, it became obvious, or it became clear to me anyway, that the descriptions of the spiritual experiences undergone by figures in the text, sounded much like what the DMT volunteers were describing. The visions and the voices. It was extremely interactive, extremely relational, full of stuff. The personality and the self and the will of the individual was intact. So the quality of the state was quite similar. Plus the reality of the prophetic state or the visionary state in the Bible completely replaces anything else going on in one's ongoing experience. So both the quality of the state and the incredibly real feeling of it were both quite consistent, with the DMT experience. So I started thinking, oh, gee, I wonder if you could, if the phenomenology of the states overlaps to, such a large degree, does the information, nature of the states overlap as well? And if not, in what, sort of ways? And if so, then in what kind of ways? Yeah, so I started to, come up with this, notion of a prophetic state of consciousness, which I guess is, prophecy. And, so I, define, prophecy as any spiritual experience described, by any figure in the Hebrew Bible. So it could be, the classical, prophets like Ezekiel and his chariot with, the angels with the eyes on their backs and their eyes on their wings and, the roaring waters and the spinning wheels and all those things. or it could be just, like a, soldier, having a, dream which, predicts the future. Most, people think of, prophecy as, foretelling or predicting, but, that is that's an artifact of the Greek translation of the Hebrew word for prophet. The Hebrew word for, prophet is navi, which, means, to interpret or to translate or to, comment on, to be a spokesman, for, as opposed, to, predicting the future.
Mm-hmm.
The Greek translation of navi was prophetes, and the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was the first, non-Hebrew, version of, the Hebrew Bible. It came out maybe, 150 BCE or something.
Mm-hmm.
The Greeks were extremely interested in using altered states to predict the future. That's, where the, notion of,
Oracles,
so that's, where the notion, so that's, where the divination, notion comes in, to divine, which is divine, is, to predict the future. And in the same way, the Greeks were interested in, foretelling, so they were, focused on, the predictive elements, which, which occurred, sometimes in people experiencing spiritual states in the Bible, but oftentimes, that never happened. There weren't any predictions,
mm-hmm.
but people still experience, visions and voices, inspiration, those kinds of things. So my, definition of, the prophetic state is much, broader than, strictly, divining or foretelling or predicting.
Mm-hmm.
So using that, larger definition, I started to, categorize any description of, prophetic, consciousness with the reports of my DMT volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of did a side-by-side comparison
Mm-hmm.
in my new book.
Mm-hmm.
So the overlap in phenomenology is really striking. It's really unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
Which I have to tell you was a big relief, because I had been thinking, they're quite similar.
Right.
There's a really cool idea, but is it true? So I think one of the reasons that it took me 16 years to write this book is that I was afraid to really put the pedal to the metal and see, well, are the effects that similar? But thankfully they were. But then again, once I began to make quite careful comparisons, there were differences.
Mm-hmm.
And the first were in the realm of the nature of the interactions,
Mm-hmm.
Between somebody in a prophetic state and somebody in a DMT state.
Mm.
The nature of the nature of the interactions was a lot more fulsome, a lot more complex, a lot more sophisticated in the descriptions of the text. And then I began to look at, well, what is the purpose of the interactions, the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I began to kind of turn to the prophetic state and the prophetic text, the Hebrew Bible, as my default, when I was struck by the information which was being transmitted. The major the major function for of the interactions between somebody in either a prophetic state or in a DMT state is communication, and it's mostly verbal communication.
Mm-hmm.
And the Hebrew Bible is a verbal work. It isn't a piece of art. It's not a painting. It's text with a lot of words and a lot of ideas. So I then started to look at the Hebrew Bible as a possible key, like a verbal cognitive key, to interpret what was going on in the psychedelic state. Like for example, if you look at the interactions between people in a prophetic state, and they're speaking with angels or they're speaking with God, there are formalities and tools and techniques for being able to to ask the right questions, to understand the answers, to know how to communicate that information either to yourself or to other people after you come down. So that's kind of the main thrust of my new book, is to get people to look at the Hebrew Bible, of all things, as a way to understand and integrate whatever spiritual properties might accrue to somebody entering into the contemporary Western psychedelic experience.
So you said
as compared to Buddhism or Latin American shamanism.
Right. So what did you see as the you said that one of the differences is kind of the type of information and the dialogue that they had with these other beings. What were the similarities, and what were were those the primary differences, and what were the similarities that you noted?
Well, I looked, mostly, for the Bible, or at the Bible, for developing a system of information, or of the messages. So when it came to so when it came to the DMT state, the information was just not all that interesting or full or novel or complex, variegated at all. So instead of using the DMT state as my default, as I did for the phenomenological comparison of the two states, the visions and the voices and the emotions, honed in, or focused on the text of scripture for the default. So the two main messages in the Hebrew Bible are the existence of one God, and also the golden rule. So one of those pieces of information speaks of our relationship with the spiritual world, and the other primary teaching focuses in on our relationship with the outside world, with the physical world, with other humans, and with the earth, and with animals and plants and whatnot. So to the extent that there were pieces of information that volunteers gleaned in the DMT state about the nature of the spiritual universe, and the nature of the moral universe, the interactive universe, they were similar. They were similar. But obviously, you could get a lot more information, and hopefully use that information in the psychedelic state, which exists in the text.
Well, I wonder if it goes back to the comment you made earlier about set and setting. I mean, you have someone who's doing prophecy that may actually have spent a lot of time learning religious texts and such. I don't know. I wonder if it's a set scenario or not, because the person is the prophet somehow different than a subject, or is it the DMT? Anyway, so that's just I have that question, and then I also wanted to know, you have a really You went in with a theory of, is it a tops down or bottoms up approach with DMT, and what is its role in 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 maybe the soul's connection through this whole process. Um, can you explain what your conclusions are after, you hypothesize about it, what your conclusions are on that?
Yeah. Well, with respect, to your first question,
Mm-hmm.
you're kind of, wondering about, the qualifications, for prophecy. Um, yeah, so I mean that's obviously a huge issue. One thing I should, point out is I'm not, suggesting that the, figures in the Hebrew Bible, took any drugs. They didn't smoke
Yeah,
DMT. They weren't around,
I wasn't expecting that.
mushrooms
Mm-hmm.
or yeah, yeah. Y- well, over the years, a number of people have speculated that the Hebrews in the desert or the prophets in Judea or Samaria used
Oh.
plants or funguses or other psychedelic substances coming in from the outside, but the presence of DMT in our own bodies and the similarity between non-drug states and the DMT state, those provide evidence or support for the idea that the individual's own levels of DMT or some DMT like process were activated in the prophetic state, and elevated levels of naturally occurring DMT were responsible, for the phenomenology of the prophetic experience, the visions and the
Mm-hmm.
voices. The ideas, the words, the the notions which are beheld, understood, and then communicated. Those occur in a different part of the mind. Those occur in the intellect, as opposed to the imaginative
Mm.
sphere in which the visions and the voices occur.
Mm.
And
Mm-hmm.
well, so that bespeaks the importance of coming in to any state like that with as well developed an intellect as is possible.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of an anti-intellectual trend in the psychedelic experience. Even within the research model, but especially within the recreational model, the hedonic model, the aesthetic model. It's ineffable. You can't describe it, but there's ineffable and
Mm-hmm.
there's ineffable. You can try.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to say it's ineffable and I
Right.
can't think about it, or if I think about it, I'm going to contaminate it. I mean, you can approximate it, and I think one of the strengths of the Hebrew Bible is that it uses a lot of words to approximate the prophetic state.
Mm-hmm.
And you read those words and you resonate and you
Mm-hmm.
enter into a mild prophetic state.
Mm.
The more you're able to understand what the text is saying.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so that also, kind of, points, to the, role of perhaps stimulating the imagination with the psychedelics in order to understand the text better. Because if you're thinking about the text as a
Mm.
prophetic text,
Mm-hmm.
which is downloaded as it were in a prophetic state, which shares some features with the psychedelic one, then you might be able to resonate more closely with the state of mind out of which the text emerged,
Mm-hmm.
and thus be able to understand it better,
Mm.
relate to it better.
Mm.
Um, so there's the top-down model and the bottom-up model of spiritual experience. The current, reigning paradigm within, the research community is, that it's your brain on drugs mostly. There's a reflex in the brain which is, triggered, by the application of certain stimuli, like prayer, meditation, sleep deprivation, fasting, psychedelic drugs, and after the case or after the fact, it's called the spiritual experience, and the brain is designed that way for evolutionary purposes. People theoretically might be more altruistic after a big psychedelic experience, or more creative. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, that's kind of gilding the lily in a lot of ways. Because people can abuse psychedelics. They could become bad people rather than good people after taking psychedelics. There isn't anything intrinsic to the drugs that is beneficial. It has to be steered using the optimal well, you need to optimize the set and the setting if you want the optimal effect. So the top down model is more of a spiritually oriented one, which I developed through my study of the prophetic experience and the medieval Jewish philosophers who speak about the brain is the organ or is the conduit for spiritual experience or spiritual information to be transmitted downward from the divine or from God or from this the spiritual realm. And that's why the brain is configured as it is in order to provide access to that kind of communication. So that I think expands the definition or the model, because it would help explain that all psychedelic experiences or all prophetic experiences are not pleasant, aren't euphoric, aren't pointing towards everything is going to be all right. It can explain some of the paradoxical information which is contained in the text, or things in the text that just don't make any sense. I think it's just it's too easy to fall into the trap of thinking of humans as the apex of the universe, and we can understand everything from the point of view of evolution. If you take a larger perspective, a kind of God's eye view of the situation, it includes or creates space for things being incomprehensible and mysterious, as well as explicable and logical, meeting our own ideas.
Right. So it could be that Steve Jobs came up with the iPhone because it was just beamed down to his brain, right, by some higher force. And my own experience is that the Carlos Castaneda, I think is his name, had idea that spiritual experiences can be through effort, sometimes through the connection with a divine being that holds a higher energy, and sometimes being spontaneous, inexplicable things, where I've actually had those things where I was just gardening one day and boom, I went into some weird reality that I didn't even understand. And so sometimes I think that that's an example of the tops down, where it's inexplicable. I didn't do anything. I wasn't praying. I wasn't meditating. Now, I've done prayer and meditation, but that wasn't what caused that. It was just everyday activity, gardening, and boom, I went into some other space. So at least my own personal experience feels like a validation that it is both a top down and a bottoms up. At least that's what that quote would say. So are you going to do a second movie on this book?
Well, that book isn't getting quite the traction that the DMT one did. It's a harder read.
Yeah.
You know, and I think in a lot of cases, uh, the Hebrew Bible is a tough nut to crack, and
Mm-hmm.
people don't even want to make the attempt because of all of
Mm.
their negative associations to the text.
Ah, I see.
But you know, I think what we're in denial about controls us the most.
Mm.
So this is a this is a biblical culture, biblical civilization.
Mm.
Our law, our philosophy, our economics, our architecture, our ethics, our morals, our kids' names, they're all biblical. So I think I think that ignoring the text isn't a good idea. And if you see the results of this last presidential election, it's just one more example of the strength of that text.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't master and channel what's contained in it, I think it's to our disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's good to know what's out there and what's being used and what's permeating our minds and our consciousness and our civilization. So, but still, I take people by the hand in the book and kind of walk them through how I got from giving IV DMT to becoming an amateur Bible scholar, and I hope anyway that it's palatable enough and interesting enough that people will be patient enough to work through their own resistances, both intellectual, emotional, psychological,
Mm-hmm.
to digging into the text, because I think in a lot of ways it's the best thing out there for
Mm-hmm.
understanding the vast majority of psychedelic experiences.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for writing this book. I thought it was fabulous. And for this interview, thank you so much.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. Would love your support in any way by giving me comments below or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.